a freezing K9's German Shepherd, exhausted and trembling, trudged through the snow with 3 helpless puppies by his side. His strength was fading, his eyes filled with desperation. But then, he saw a light in the backyard of a stranger. What happened next will leave you speechless. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring story like this one. Now, let's dive in. The wind howled through the frozen trees, whipping against the thick fur of the German Shepherd as he pressed forward through the knee-deep snow. His breath came in heavy, ragged puffs, each exhale forming tiny clouds of mist in the bitter night air. His paws, once strong and unyielding, now stung with pain as frost clung to the pads. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the lives of his 3 tiny pups depended on him. Behind him, the 3 shivering puppies struggled to keep up. Their small bodies weren't built for this brutal cold. They whimpered softly, their tiny legs sinking into the deep snow with every step. He turned his head, his sharp eyes filled with worry as he counted them. 1, 2, 3. They were still there, still alive. But for how much longer? The K9 had once been strong. He had been a warrior, a protector. Trained for the toughest police missions, he had faced criminals, explosives, and danger without fear. But nothing had prepared him for this, a fight against nature itself. His name had once been Titan, but now he was nothing more than a lost soul, a discarded hero. The night before, Titan had been curled up in a makeshift shelter beneath the remains of an abandoned shed. The roof had caved in from the weight of the snow, leaving him exposed to the brutal wind. His pups had nestled against his belly, desperate for warmth. He had held them close, shielding them as best as he could. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. If they stayed here, they would die. So, as the first light of dawn touched the sky, he had made a choice. He would keep moving until he found shelter, food, or a miracle. But the storm had other plans. A fresh gust of wind sent ice cutting against his face, forcing him to lower his head. His ears flicked forward as he scanned the landscape. Snow stretched endlessly in every direction, covering the fields and roads in a thick, merciless blanket. The world was silent, aside from the relentless wind and the muffled whimpers of his pups. Then, through the white haze, he saw it. A house. It wasn't far. A 2-story farmhouse stood at the edge of a wooded lot, its windows glowing with the soft golden light of a fire inside. Smoke curled from the chimney, a promise of warmth. Safety. Titan's heart pounded. This was their only chance. He turned to his pups, nudging them gently. They were weak. Their tiny bodies shook uncontrollably. They wouldn't last much longer. With one last deep breath, Titan gathered his strength and pushed forward. The backyard was silent except for the wind rattling against the wooden fence. Titan climbed over a small snowdrift and stepped onto the frozen grass. His legs wobbled beneath him, exhaustion threatening to take over. But he couldn't stop now. With a low whine, he turned to the smallest of his pups, a fragile little one with a darker coat. The pup had collapsed, its tiny body barely moving. Panic shot through Titan like lightning. He nudged the puppy with his nose, urging it to stand, but the little one was too weak. No, not now. Not after everything. Titan let out a desperate bark. Once, twice. Inside the house, the sound of clinking dishes stopped. A man sat at his kitchen table, staring at the storm through the window. His name was Daniel Hayes, a retired firefighter who had seen more than his share of heartbreak. His wife had passed away 5 years ago, leaving the house cold and empty. Since then, it had been just him, the long winters, and memories that never faded. Then, he heard it. A bark, faint, but urgent. Daniel's brow furrowed. He pushed back his chair and stood, moving to the window. He squinted into the darkness, his eyes adjusting to the swirling snow. Then, he saw movement. A dog. No, 4 dogs. Daniel's heart clenched. What the hell were they doing out there in this weather? Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat and rushed to the back door. Titan's legs nearly gave out when the back door creaked open. Warm light spilled into the frozen yard, and the scent of something familiar, human, filled his nose. He lifted his head, eyes locking onto the man standing in the doorway. The stranger hesitated for only a second before stepping out into the snow. "Hey boy, what are you doing out here?" His voice was deep, but gentle, concerned. Titan let out another whine, then nudged the motionless pup at his feet. Daniel's calm dropped, and his breath caught. A puppy, barely moving, its tiny chest rising and falling weakly. "Damn it," he muttered. He crouched down and reached out a hand, but Titan flinched. Daniel paused. "It's okay, big guy. I'm not gonna hurt you." Titan's body tensed. He had been trained to assess threats, to protect. But something in this man's voice told him the truth. He wasn't a threat. Just a moment of hesitation. Then, he stepped back, allowing the man closer. Daniel wasted no time. Carefully, he scooped the tiny pup into his arms, his fingers brushing against its frozen fur. "You're freezing," he whispered. He looked at the other 2 puppies, still shivering but awake, and then at Titan, who stood watching him with tired, wary eyes. Daniel knew one thing. If he didn't act fast, they wouldn't make it. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you all inside." Titan hesitated for only a second. Then, as if making the hardest decision of his life, he stepped forward, following the man into the warmth of the house. The warmth of the house was like a balm to Titan's frozen body. The moment the door shut behind him, he could feel the heat pressing in on all sides, wrapping around him like a soft blanket. His tense muscles relaxed for the first time in what felt like forever. But even though the warmth felt good, the weight of his responsibility, his pups, never left him. His heart still raced, his eyes scanning the room in search of safety. He would never stop protecting them. The man, Daniel, moved quickly, setting the small pup on a towel near the fireplace and working as quickly as he could. He had seen animals in bad shape before, but nothing like this. Titan's pups were shivering uncontrollably, their little bodies limp and trembling with the cold. Daniel didn't waste any time. He rushed to grab a blanket, spreading it over the puppy and the others to shield them from the coldy air that still clung to their fur. "Hang in there, little ones," Daniel murmured, rubbing the tiniest one's chest in a desperate attempt to revive the weak pulse beneath the cold skin. His heart sank as he watched the fragile creature. Time was running out. Titan watched him from a corner of the room, eyes narrowed with suspicion, but a part of him couldn't help but feel the smallest glimmer of hope. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to have in a long time. His instinct to protect was still as strong as ever, but the exhaustion was starting to take its toll. Every part of his body ached with the effort of keeping himself upright. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound filling the room. Daniel, kneeling beside the puppies, didn't take his eyes off them, trying to warm them, comfort them. Titan's gaze stayed fixed on him. He had seen too many faces, too many strangers who had shown up only to disappoint him. But this man, something about him was different. Titan let out a soft growl, barely audible as he moved closer, instinctively positioning himself between Daniel and his pups. The protective nature of his training had never gone away, even in the midst of despair. He couldn't afford to trust. Not entirely. "Easy, boy," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not going to hurt them. I'm not going to hurt you. Just trying to help." Titan's ears flicked back, still uncertain, but he didn't move. The man seemed sincere. Titan could sense that much, but trust had to be earned. For a few moments, the room was still, save for the soft sounds of the fire and the occasional whine from one of the puppies. Titan's gaze moved from the pups back to Daniel, studying him closely. This man was different from the others. He didn't seem afraid, and he didn't seem like someone who would abandon them. "Good boy," Daniel muttered, noticing Titan's subtle shift. "You're a good boy." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small packet of dog treats, the kind that were usually reserved for his own dogs when he had them back in the days before his retirement. Titan's nostrils flared, his eyes locked on the treats in Daniel's hand. He didn't move, not yet. Trust had to come in increments after all. But the warmth in the room, the steady care Daniel was showing his pups, and the way the man's hand held the treats out slowly, all of it softened the tension in Titan's body. Slowly, cautiously, Titan took a few steps forward, his eyes never leaving the man's hand. Daniel remained still, not moving a muscle, allowing Titan to approach on his own terms. Finally, Titan leaned in and took the treat, his teeth barely grazing Daniel's fingers. He stepped back immediately, his eyes wide and watchful, as though measuring the man's every move. "That's it?" Daniel said with a soft smile. "That's better. You're a good boy, Titan." The words felt like a balm to the German Shepherd's broken spirit. It had been so long since anyone had called him by his name, long before he had been abandoned. For a moment, it felt like a glimpse into a past he had almost forgotten, but the pups were still the priority. Titan glanced down at them again, his ears pricked, sensing the danger was near from over. The smallest one, the dark-coated pup, was still barely breathing, its body cold and stiff. Daniel had no idea how much time they had left. His heart pounded in his chest as he leaned closer to the fireplace, attempting to warm his hands before gently pressing them to the pups. The larger ones seemed to be responding to the heat, their little bodies growing slightly warmer to the touch. But the smallest one, Daniel swallowed hard. "Come on, kid. Please don't go. You've made it this far." Titan watched in silence, his body coiled with tension, waiting for any sign that they had made it in time. He couldn't bear the thought of losing one of his own. The silence in the room seemed to stretch on forever. Then, a soft whimper broke through the stillness. Titan's ears shot up. The tiny pup, the one that had been the weakest, took a shaky breath and let out a faint, pitiful cry. Titan's body jerked in response. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on the tiny form as it gave a small, unsteady wriggle. The moment was so fragile, so delicate. Daniel's heart raced as he looked at the pup, then back at Titan. "You hear that, buddy?" he whispered. "She's not giving up." Titan's tail twitched, almost imperceptibly. The smallest pup was still alive. There was hope after all, but that hope came with a price. The storm outside wasn't getting any better. It wasn't going to wait, and neither would the cold. Daniel knew he didn't have much time. He needed to act fast. With renewed urgency, he scooped up the puppies one by one and wrapped them in warm blankets, setting them near the fire where they could slowly regain their strength. His mind raced with questions, with concerns. How would he keep them all safe? Where had they come from? And most importantly, why had they ended up in his yard in the middle of a snowstorm? But for now, those questions would have to wait. He looked at Titan, his heart full of gratitude and concern. The big canine's eyes softened just a little, a flicker of trust beginning to take root. And in that moment, Daniel made a silent promise. He would not let them go, not after what they had been through. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the room, but outside the storm raged on, a relentless force that shook the house's foundation. Titan's keen ears could hear the wind howling against the walls, the snow battering against the windows as if trying to break in. It felt like the world itself was closing in on them. The pups, wrapped in warm blankets, had begun to stir, their small bodies moving ever so slightly as they recovered from the brutal cold. Daniel was still kneeling by them, keeping a close watch, his hands gently brushing through their fur, trying to bring them back to life. He was exhausted. His hands were stiff from the cold, and his muscles ached from the long hours of caring for the animals. But he didn't care. His focus was entirely on the puppies, on getting them through the storm. Titan stood near the door, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the snow swirling outside. He had come from a life where every sense, every movement was calculated for survival. But this was different. This was vulnerability, and it unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside Titan's chest. He was tired, so very tired, and yet he couldn't relax, not when there was still danger lurking in the distance. The fear that had gripped him on the streets, the overwhelming sense of being abandoned, of having nowhere to go, had not fully released its hold on him. He wasn't sure who he could trust anymore, or if he could trust at all. Daniel had proven himself kind, yes, but kindness didn't always mean safety. Without warning, Titan let out a soft growl, a low rumble that reverberated in his chest. Daniel looked up from the puppies, startled. His face creased in concern. Hey, Daniel said gently, his voice soft. What's wrong, boy? Titan's ears pricked up and his body tensed. He was on high alert, his instincts sharp as ever. The growl deepened, becoming a warning that echoed through the room. Daniel was about to approach when Titan's eyes darted toward the window. Something in the distance had caught his attention. A shadow. Someone, or something, was out there in the snow. For a split second, Daniel froze, unsure what Titan was reacting to. He wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions, but the tense posture of the large dog was impossible to ignore. What is it, Titan? Daniel asked, his voice now laced with worry. What's out there? Titan's gaze never left the window, his growl turning into a low, warning bark. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Was it someone coming to harm them? A person, maybe? He glanced at the puppies. They were still fragile, their tiny bodies too weak to move far from their blankets. The idea of leaving them, even for a second, filled Daniel with dread. But Titan had never been wrong before. His instincts were flawless. Without thinking, Daniel grabbed his jacket, his hand gripping the door handle. Titan, still on edge, stepped toward him, his body blocking the door in a protective stance. Daniel's heart clenched. The canine had clearly grown attached to his pups, but he had also grown attached to Daniel too. Easy, boy, Daniel murmured, crouching to Titan's level. We'll check it out. But you need to stay inside with them, okay? I'll be back in a second. Titan didn't respond. His eyes were locked onto Daniel's, a silent plea passing between them. He wasn't going to let Daniel leave without him. Not now. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. There was no other option. You're coming with me then, he said softly. Titan's ears perked up at the sound of those words. He gave a slight wag of his tail, but his muscles were still stiff with anxiety. The storm outside was unrelenting, and Titan could sense the danger closing in. The unknown was always the most dangerous. Together they moved toward the door, Titan's heavy paws making soft thuds against the wooden floor. Daniel opened the door just a crack, peering into the swirling white storm. His eyes narrowed, trying to spot any movement in the thick haze of snow. Nothing. He hesitated for a moment, the cold air biting at his skin, but Titan was already pushing past him, stepping into the snow with determination. Daniel quickly followed, closing the door behind him and bracing against the cold. The storm lashed at their faces, snowflakes stinging their skin like icy needles. Daniel squinted into the blizzard, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There were no clear figures, just the endless swirl of snow and ice. But Titan was moving with purpose, his nose low to the ground, his body tense with every step. "What is it, Titan?" Daniel whispered, his voice nearly lost to the wind. Titan didn't answer. He was leading the way, his sharp nose tracing something in the snow. Daniel followed closely behind, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what they were searching for, but Titan's instincts were pulling him towards something, and he trusted them with his life. Suddenly, Titan stopped. He sniffed the air, his ears perked up. A low growl rumbled in his throat again. Daniel looked around frantically, but there was still nothing in sight. "Titan, what?" Then, in the distance, he saw it. A figure, barely visible against the blizzard, moving toward them. A person. Titan's body stiffened, and he barked again, more urgently this time. The figure paused, and for a moment, there was nothing but the deafening sound of the wind. Then, the figure took a step forward, and the unmistakable sound of a voice reached Daniel's ears. "Hey, is anyone out there? Please, help me." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. A woman, barely standing, her face pale and weathered by the storm. She was dragging something behind her, another animal perhaps? "Titan, wait!" Daniel shouted. But the K9 was already moving, pushing through the snow toward the figure. The stranger was on her knees now, struggling to stay upright. Her eyes met Daniel's through the storm, wide with desperation. "Please, I need help." Daniel didn't hesitate. Titan had already made his decision. It was time to act. "Come on, Titan," he said, his voice firm. "We've got this." The storm raged around them, an unrelenting force of nature that seemed to swallow the world whole. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps, the cold seeping through his jacket, making his teeth chatter. Titan, with his thick coat and determined stride, pushed forward without hesitation, his eyes locked on the figure ahead. "Stay back, Titan," Daniel murmured. But Titan wasn't listening. His instincts were in overdrive. The K9 was already on the move, his powerful legs cutting through the snow toward the woman who had collapsed on the ground. She was kneeling, clutching her arms around her body in an attempt to shield herself from the harsh wind. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. The look in her eyes, raw, filled with desperation, struck Daniel like a punch to the gut. "Please?" she gasped again, her voice barely audible against the wind. "I need help. My dog. He's out there." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Her dog? Was this what Titan had sensed? "Titan, easy," Daniel called out. But Titan was already beside her, his large form blocking the wind as he stood protectively. His eyes, filled with intelligence and caution, scanned the woman. But his attention was still focused on the snowstorm. The woman's trembling hand reached out toward Titan, and for a moment, she seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to trust him. Then, seeing the K9's calm but resolute presence, she lowered her hand, a faint, grateful smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You're a good boy," she whispered, her voice full of exhaustion. She managed to reach for her jacket, her fingers slow and stiff, before she pointed toward the woods that loomed in the distance. "He's out there," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, I can't lose him too." Daniel's heart sank. This was far more complicated than he had imagined. Not only was this woman caught in the same brutal storm, but her dog, where was he? The woman's state suggested she had been through something traumatic, and her dog's well-being was clearly her last hope. Titan turned his head toward Daniel, his expression unreadable but focused. There was no doubt in the K9's mind. This was his mission now. "Hold on," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the storm swirling around them. He knelt beside the woman, doing his best to shield her from the biting wind. "What happened to your dog?" The woman's eyes filled with tears as she spoke, her voice cracking with grief. He's my partner, my only family. We got separated when the storm hit. I don't know how far he made it, but I can't leave him out there. Not in this. Daniel's mind raced. He couldn't imagine the pain of losing a partner like that. He had seen firsthand the bond between a handler and a working dog. They weren't just animals. They were family. "Okay," Daniel said after a long pause. "We'll find him, but we need to get you inside first." He moved to help the woman to her feet, but she winced, her legs unsteady. She was cold, too cold. Her hands were trembling violently, and it was clear she was on the edge of collapse. "No," she said, shaking her head desperately. "I can't go inside. I have to find him. I can't leave him." Daniel's heart squeezed. She was determined, and he understood that kind of loyalty. But he couldn't let her continue in this state. She was barely standing, and the storm would only get worse. "We will find him," Daniel insisted. "But you can't go on like this. Titan and I will look for him. You need to get inside and warm up." The woman hesitated, her face racked with pain, but then she nodded slowly. "Please, be careful." Her voice was barely a whisper. Titan turned his head toward Daniel, as if awaiting orders. Daniel gave him a firm nod. "We'll be back. Stay here, okay?" Titan's tail twitched briefly, and then he looked back at the woman one last time before bounding into the storm. The wind whipped through Daniel's face as he followed Titan into the thick snow. He glanced over his shoulder, just in time to see the woman disappear inside the warmth of his house, her figure swallowed by the storm. For a moment, the sense of urgency settled in, and Daniel forced himself to focus. Titan was already out ahead of him, his nose low to the ground, sniffing through the snow, determined to find whatever scent had been left behind. Daniel's heart raced. He knew they were running out of time. Titan paused in his tracks, his body stiffening. His ears stood upright as he sniffed the air, the muscles in his legs coiled with energy. Daniel quickened his pace, staying close to Titan's side as they moved further into the woods. The storm seemed to thicken the air around them, making everything feel more distant, as if the world itself was slipping away. Then, Titan stopped again. This time, he growled low in his chest, his body taut with tension. Daniel froze, instinctively lowering his voice. "What is it, boy?" Titan's head snapped in the direction of a small clearing ahead, the scent of another dog strong in the air. Daniel's heart jumped. They were close. The moment Titan darted forward, Daniel followed, his eyes searching the white void ahead. In the clearing, partially hidden by snow and broken branches, lay a dog. A large, dark-coated shepherd, his eyes wide with fear and pain. It was the woman's dog. Daniel's stomach twisted. The dog's leg was caught in a snare trap, and blood was already beginning to pool in the snow beneath him. He was struggling, trying to free himself, but it was clear he didn't have much time. Titan rushed to the dog's side, his movements precise and gentle as he nudged the injured animal. Daniel was right behind him, his hands shaking as he knelt beside the dog, careful not to make the injury worse. "Easy, buddy," Daniel whispered, working quickly to release the trap. "We've got you. You're going to be okay." Titan stood beside the dog, his watchful eyes never leaving Daniel's hands. The canine's presence was like a silent reassurance. Everything would be all right. Daniel worked quickly, his fingers cold and stiff, but the adrenaline was driving him forward. It felt like the world was closing in, the storm intensifying, but he couldn't let the dog suffer. He had to act fast. With one last pull, the snare broke, and the dog let out a painful but relieved whimper. Daniel quickly checked the injury, deep but not fatal. He had to get him back to the house. Titan nudged the dog gently, his instincts guiding him. Together they helped the injured shepherd to his feet, and Daniel stood, gripping the dog's side to steady him. They had no time to waste. The storm was still raging, and the woman was waiting. "We're coming, buddy," Daniel said, his voice filled with determination. "We're coming home." The wind screamed like a wild animal, howling and biting at every inch of exposed skin. Snow whipped across Daniel's face, stinging his eyes, and the icy peed seemed to freeze his bones with every step he took. He kept his hand on the injured dog's side, steadying him as they trudged back through the thick snow. Titan moved ahead of them, his powerful form cutting through the storm with ease, his amisams tracking their path back to safety. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest, urgency pulsing through him. The woman's dog had been in bad shape, and although he was relieved to have freed him from the snare, there was no telling how much longer he would last in the freezing conditions. The dog's breathing was ragged, and every time he took a step, Daniel could feel his body trembling under the strain. "We're almost there, buddy," Daniel whispered, trying to reassure the injured dog. His voice was barely audible against the storm, but it was a comfort nonetheless. Titan, always the watchful protector, kept glancing back at them as he led the way. His fur was matted with snow, his breath misting in the cold air, but his focus never wavered. A sudden low whine broke through the wind, and Daniel looked over at the injured D. He could see the fear in his eyes, the pain, the confusion. It wasn't just physical. The dog was terrified. He was afraid of something deep inside. Daniel understood that kind of fear. He had seen it in countless faces before, both human and canine. It was the fear of being abandoned, of being lost. "You're not alone," Daniel said softly, though he knew the dog couldn't understand his words. "We're taking you home. Just hold on." Titan paused up ahead, his body tense. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. Before he could take another step, the sound of footsteps reached his ears. A low crunch against the snow, slow but deliberate. Daniel's pulse quickened. It wasn't the wind or the storm. It was someone moving through the woods. Titan's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl, warning the approaching figure. Daniel froze, his eyes scanning the blizzard, trying to make out any shapes in the storm. But everything around him was a blur, the snow swirling too thick to see clearly. "Titan," Daniel whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for his flashlight. "Stay close." Titan's growl deepened, but his eyes never left the direction of the sound. He was ready. Then, through the snow, a figure emerged. It was the woman. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He had half expected someone else, maybe another threat, but it was her, the woman they had left behind. "What are you doing out here?" Daniel called out, his voice rising over the storm. "You need to get back inside." The woman's face was pale, her eyes wild with worry, her hands shaking as she clutched her jacket tight around her body. "I couldn't stay," she gasped, her words nearly lost to the howling wind. "I couldn't let him die out here alone." Daniel's heart twisted. She hadn't just lost a dog, she had lost everything. Her bond with this dog was deep, more than just a partnership. It was love. "I told you to stay back," Daniel said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You're going to freeze out here." I couldn't. She trailed off, her eyes locked on her dog, who had been struggling to walk but now stumbled forward, drawn by the sound of her voice. "Please, let me help him." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I can't do that. Not in this storm." But Titan, ever perceptive, was already moving toward her. The K9's body language had softened, and he nudged the woman gently with his head, as if telling her to follow him. She hesitated for a moment, looking at the dog she had just freed, then back at Daniel. "I'm not leaving him. Not again." Her words were firm, and Daniel could see there was no persuading her. She had made up her mind. He glanced at the injured dog, who was clearly weakening, his steps more labored with each passing minute. Daniel didn't have much of a choice now. If the woman was going to insist on staying, then he needed to help her. "All right," Daniel said, his voice softening. "Come on, we'll make it together." Titan turned and trotted ahead, guiding them back toward the house. Daniel kept his hand on the woman's shoulder, steadying her as they moved through the storm. The injured dog was doing his best to keep up, but with every step, it became more and more clear that his strength was failing. Then, suddenly, the dog collapsed. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he saw the large shepherd crumple to the ground, his body sliding on the snow as he let out a weak whine. The woman gasped, rushing to his side. "No!" she cried, falling to her knees beside him. "Please, no!" Titan immediately stepped in, his body low and protective, as he nudged the injured mount with his nose. He didn't growl, didn't bark. He simply stayed close, offering a silent promise. Daniel crouched down, moving beside the woman. "He's not giving up yet," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to keep him moving. He can't stay here." But the dog's eyes were glazed, his body shivering uncontrollably, and it was clear that his strength was nearly gone. The woman cradled his head in her lap, tears streaking down her face. "I can't lose him," she whispered. "I can't lose him too." Titan stepped back, then turned his head toward Daniel. His eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, held the answer. He knew what had to be done. "All right," Daniel muttered under his breath. "I need you to help me." Without a word, Titan lowered his body, as though inviting the woman to hold on. "Titan," Daniel said softly, "we need to get him back to the house. He won't make it if we don't act fast." Titan gave a single nod, subtle, but unmistakable. The K9 was ready. With the woman's help, Daniel and Titan carefully hoisted the injured dog between them, supporting his weight as they began their trek back to the house. Titan led the way, his instincts guiding them through the thick snow and brutal winds. The house was in sight, but it felt impossibly far away, as if the storm itself were trying to keep them from reaching safety. With every step, the woman's grip tightened around her dog, her face filled with determination and fear. Titan, moving ahead of them, was their anchor, the one they could trust in the midst of the chaos. And as the storm raged around them, Daniel knew that the storm within the woman's heart, her fear and grief, was just as fierce. But together, they would fight it. Together, they would make it home. Back at the house, the woman and her dog are still fighting both the storm outside and the storm within. The dog is weak, barely able to stand, and the woman is on the verge of losing hope. Daniel and Titan work relentlessly, doing everything they can to stabilize the dog, but time is running out. Titan, unwavering in his loyalty, stays by the dog's side, offering silent support. In a final desperate attempt to save him, Daniel makes the hard call. He rushes inside for first aid supplies, while Titan remains with the injured dog, refusing to leave his side. The warmth of the house offers some relief, but the true battle isn't over yet. Inside the house, Daniel and Titan manage to stabilize the injured dog, and the woman's bond with her companion is tested in the most emotional way. As the storm rages outside, the dog, despite his pain, begins to fight back, showing signs of recovery. The woman, exhausted and overwhelmed, looks to Titan for reassurance. With his calm presence, Titan becomes the bridge between human and animal, a reminder of the unbreakable bond they all share. The dog survives the night, and as the storm clears, they all find a new sense of hope. The woman, once lost in the chaos of fear, now knows that loyalty and love are stronger than any storm. Together, they've made it through.